common knowledge that global political processes are run by big politicians. Those uniting or dividing entire continents, setting the stage for new international orders, and predefining cross-national relations. Thanks to the magnitude and eventfulness of their lives, their names are forever enshrined in the history books. One such exceptionally memorable person, a Georgian, will rise to join the ranks of global leaders, setting in motion a new world order. He will tread a fine line between the formations of the 20th, 21st centuries to contribute with his charisma to channeling emerging new processes. A Georgian who will comfort his war-torn homeland, forging a state from a country embarking on a path to independence and leading it toward revival. He will save the uniqueness of a nation liberated after 2 centuries of slavery, and he will lay the groundwork for new state-building principles. You ask me if I would take the same path. I will reply, of course I would. Mr. Eduard Shevardnadze is a world-class political figure. Every person is born for a specific purpose in life. Some to become artists, others to be writers or poets. But Eduard Shevardnadze was born for politics. Besides being able to swim upstream, he was also ready to put his life on the line any given moment. When talking about a major political figure like Mr. Shevardnadze, it's an enormous responsibility not to overdo, on one hand, because it would be insulting, and not to play it down, and thus trivialize it on the other. As Americans would say, a self-made man. My career, however peculiar, has its roots in my childhood, early years, school, and family lifestyle. Naturally, it doesn't happen without maternal and paternal influence, without upbringing, but his biography testifies that he was the maker of his own destiny and the architect of the phenomena we may call Eduard Shevardnadze. He was an amazingly hard-working man, a quality grounded in his family and his roots, I believe. He was accustomed to physical work, real manual labor, since childhood. He was the youngest child, spoiled by everyone in the family. Eriko, as they would call him endearingly. I was a good student with a knack for things. I was a talented child, and people would go on telling me, "You must become a doctor." Especially persistent was my mother. "After you graduate from medical school and come back home, I will not lack for anything, and I will not die." On behalf of the youth of our republic, I would like to express enormous gratitude to the Central Committee of the party for commending our performance. Next, my political career unfolded in leaps and bounds. Becoming the leader of young Georgians fills you with pride, and you stop talking about becoming a doctor. The Republic's leadership attended the memorial's opening. He was a communist at first, then a minister who changed the world. And then he came to Georgia, a country in shambles. I've never met anyone quite like him. Mostly foreign politicians, especially the younger ones. They were born in the same era and grew up in the same paradigm in which they're running their policies. But Eduard had to change his paradigms of life repeatedly, and that too made him the giant that he was. He treated daily, humdrum, everyday routine details as non-essential. What mattered to him lay in grand, essential notions. Family, of course. Family was very big in his life. I think that family is the bedrock of humanity. It's like oxygen to me. I'm confident that my grandfather would have been half the man he was without my grandmother's backing. Both were leaders with strong personalities. Sometimes people say that two strong persons find it hard to get along, but these two were in perfect harmony. He was practically always away from home. Before leaving early in the morning, he would drop by my room and kiss me goodbye. He went to work first, and then I headed for school. He had 60 to 90 minutes around noon for lunch, about the time when we returned from school, and I don't think it was just a coincidence. Our dinner lasted 15 to 20 minutes, and he managed to communicate with us within those 15 to 20 minutes. And then he would come home late at night. In fact, I didn't see him all day. Sometimes on Sundays, we spent our free time in the great outdoors, sizzling shish kebabs with my mother picking sweet berries. Happy days, happy moments. The career of this distinguished figure consists of three stages. The Soviet rule in Georgia, when he does a lot to revive and prepare Georgia for possible independence. Then there is work on a global scale as a foreign minister of the Soviet Union, with a new world order emerging, and Viola, the evil empire collapses without another world war. Next, there's his work in independent Georgia, when the country with him at the helm emerges from chaos and lawlessness, when a genuinely independent, democratic, free country is shaped. My life unfolded playing by its own rules, those that I had to live with, those that actually existed at that time. What happened next was a triumph of common sense over fanatical sentiments. I could see a different reality on the rise, with people gradually nurturing a sense that there was some other force, other than Marxism, that they had to come to believe. But that didn't happen in a year or two. It took a long time. In the 1970s, I realized that what we called socialism was in fact a society put together under a dictatorship and built on lying to the people. But by that time, I was already a senior official, such as the first secretary of the Central Committee of Georgia, then a Politburo candidate member. I had to hold it all back. I had to keep up appearances, and that was necessary for both me and the people. Relying solely on the working methods we used 30 to 40 years ago, such as agitation, propaganda, and the perceptions rooted in us, we are very unlikely to have achieved much. What Gorbachev branded as perestroika after 1985 was actually underway here in the 1970s and 80s, though it had no name yet, because as long as Brezhnev and Suslov were alive, you would never be allowed to designate these processes in individual republics. When talking about large-scale projects, I absolutely must touch on those implemented in Georgia's villages and mountain areas. I'm talking about projects seeking to reinvigorate Hevsureti, namely Shatili, also Svaneti. Actually, the first major road was built in Zemo Svaneti. There was also the village of Cheremi in Kakheti, with its population previously deported, revived under Shevardnadze. Much is being done to breathe new life into the mountain areas, to build roads, provide television and radio broadcasting, also services and outlets to meet the population's basic living needs, and to ensure against depopulation in our mountain regions. Can you imagine what it took in that era to reclaim a desert and build a village there, install a soil flushing system, revive and reinvigorate the David Gareji Monastery, and establish the Garajoba Folk Festival? As Medico shared these ideas with Edward, he cracked a joke. You do that, and in case you get arrested, I'll make sure you get a cell with a nice view. Agricultural reforms, such as the Abasha experiment, also industrial reforms, namely the Poti experiment. We didn't call it a market economy per se, but what we did back then was essentially a market economy. I made a point of telling them that the responsibility was mine. You take as much land as you can work, then you keep half of what you grow and sell the rest to the state. They did not believe that they'd been allowed these lands, but after they loaded wagons with crops and drove home, the truth of it all apparently dawned on them. I told Gorbachev about it, and he bombarded me with all kinds of questions. How does this work? How about that? How did that happen? How could you assume the responsibility? Is there a Politburo ordinance on that? What will you say if the Politburo calls you in? What raised much concern and protest yesterday, both externally and internally, what we considered worth compromising back then is now considered a major sin that must be washed away. What we responded to with no big deal and so what, today will be taken not as so what, tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, or 5 years from now, but as this is unacceptable to our society. Kicking off the process of democratization was the hardest part. Both he and I were convinced that unless people are liberated, unless they are their own persons and masters, they will never put out enough goods, including in the spiritual realm. The Kaki Bakradze was a representative of the sphere of ideology. It was Eduard Shevardnadze's creation. Without Eduard Shevardnadze, he would not have existed, because he, while delivering public lectures in universities, openly spoke of Georgia's independence, but was never arrested. God forbid I ever wash my hands of what has been done. A lot is being done to beautify, embellish our country, our republic, and its every region. A lot is being done for fine traditions to mingle with contemporary architectural thought, worldviews, and artistic achievements. For cities to maintain their urban style, remaining quaint, and yet keeping up with the times. The unique Directorate for the Protection of Historical Monuments, established in the 1970s, was actually a totally unexpected and original move, effectively paving the way for cherishing cultural heritage and restoring monuments of culture. Urban regeneration efforts were in full swing in Tbilisi's historical section, an unprecedented undertaking in the Soviet Union at that time. And not a single ruble was allocated to this end from the centralized system. The way it was done was absolutely beautiful, keeping a low profile and utilizing internal resources. Technically, Mr. Shevardnadze, as first secretary of the Communist Party's Central Committee, was supposed to go to the Central Committee. Instead, he went to Marjanishvili's theater and attended a performance. In doing so, he singled out culture as an area of paramount significance. He never, under any formation, lost his keynote, one that embodies his amazing attitude toward art, his striking ability to analyze, generalize things, and see the bigger picture of processes, artistic events, not political ones in this case. Mr. Shevardnadze visited the studio every year. It was a crowded gathering with occasional speeches, 1 hour in all. He made a note of everything being said. He listened to everything and then responded. As a rule, he financed equipment for the studio every year. We were financed by the Moscow committee, but the studio lacked equipment. I guess it was at a meeting with theater advisors that I said, "You don't doubt that I'm against grafters, do you?" "No, of course we don't," they replied. "I wish I could live to see Rustaveli theater tickets sold under the counter." No stretch, he enjoyed spiritual friendship and affinity with most artists and scientists. People may survive starvation, but poetry is still their soul and body, an integral part of their systems, thoughts, and minds. I know one of Shota Nishnianidze's poems almost by heart. It celebrates the Abkhazian people's friendship. Honestly, I get teary-eyed every time I remember its brilliant similes. The same is true of Nodar Dumbadze's memoirs and speech, dedicated to the Abkhazian people's friendship, tied to his childhood memories and years spent in Abkhazia. I am also enormously grateful to Grigol Abashidze, who devoted an excellent essay to this issue. Also, to other comrades, mostly our authors, such as Guram Asatiani, Chabo Amarijibi, and many others. My deepest appreciation also goes to our Abkhazian comrades, Vano, who responded to Nodar's work, also Bagrat Shinkuba and others. And this is how we, together, step by step, brick by brick, investing enough commitment and dedication, trust and faith in this great friendship, can build a strong, long-lasting brotherhood and friendship in Georgia. My father had a lot of respect for him, and Mr. Shevardnadze cherished the relationship. This relationship has profited me tremendously. When facing serious tasks, both in Georgia and beyond, I drew heavily on my friendly relationships with the Georgian intelligentsia, also benefiting from occasional opportunities to read their works before publication. Not that I meant to correct them, they just knew I was interested. I was, and still, am proud of this relationship. A youth group was established through the efforts of Komsomol members, and so was a body of young authors from the 1960s generation. There were Nodar Dumbadze and others. Irakli and Grigol Abashidze would drop by once in a while. But Simon Cikovani was our most frequent guest. We drew major lessons from communicating with him. In fact, those were the best lessons shaping my attitude toward Georgian culture and writers. I was a young man, not completely beardless, but still beardless though. Any operation that they took on had a code of conduct to uphold. The main goal was to work toward a Georgian cause, except that it was a time when every Georgian cause had to be camouflaged in one format or another. I remember my father say that Shevardnadze was a brilliant man of the highest magnitude, who would surely go on to do a lot of good work for the country. A dedicated patriot, a man full of energy. Edward has done so much good for actors, singers, writers, academics. He really doted on them. And generally, the kind of books that were published then. My Ukrainian colleague told me about one of Eduard Shevardnadze's works. I read it in translation. Aren't you afraid of publishing books like this? Aren't you afraid? But this is a classic. The truth about life is told by a great artist. There were too many publications to single out one. Dato Tutashkia, maybe? Incidentally, there's one fascinating story. Jansug Charkviani asks Shevardnadze, Mr. Shevardnadze, if we roll out this book, I'll be arrested. Who will take care of my wife and children then? The answer was very interesting. Part one of the publication was already out of print. So they're dining, and Shevardnadze replies, go ahead and publish it. Taking care of your wife and children is not a problem. He was very friendly, much like the filmmakers and the authors of the 1960s generation. Developing intellectual resources, that's what mattered to me, not taking to the streets with posters, which was too early at that time. The 1970s, when Mr. Eduard Shevardnadze came to power, were pivotal for culture. For instance, and I always cite this example, Sturua's political theater. Georgian theater was booming. I remember Rustaveli Theater's performances staged by Robert Sturua with my input. First, the Culture Ministry's commission would come, usually with a prejudicial attitude, and take seats in an empty auditorium. Then there would be the head of the Central Committee's Culture Department, followed by the same committee's Ideology Secretary. Dissatisfaction persisted until Mr. Eduard Shevardnadze expressed his positive attitude. As Ramas Chekvadze told me, Kwakvari, after premiering, was performed daily for 6 days, attended by Minister Taktakishvili and Victoria Siradze. And the message was that the show had to be put off, referring to allusions here and insinuations there. I decided to have a look at it. On the 6th day, Mr. Shevardnadze arrived. After the show, he went up to the stage and congratulated everyone. He saved the show, because it was about to be put on the show. I convened the Bureau the following morning to announce that I was assuming full responsibility, adding that the show stood for genuine creativity, and banning it would stand for waving off creativity in Georgia. It was like dropping a bomb at that time, you know? I mean, giving the go-ahead to Robert Sturua's performance. The same happened in the case of staging the Caucasian chalk circle, followed by Richard III. He realized that unless Georgia, with its multitude of talents, keeps singing and embracing arts, unless it stages plays and makes movies, it will sink into oblivion in this frantic world, explaining why he did his best to give a hand to the arts. And these performances secured global recognition for Georgian theater. Tengiz Abuladze shared with me his idea of repentance. I asked, "And how do you see going about this?" It was way before Gorbachev. The idea was conceived in the 1980s. He replied, "Shevardnadze told me to give it a go." To tell the truth, the script rocked me to my core and kept me up 2 nights in a row as I imagined it on the silver screen. It would be impossible to make this film riding only on one's own ambition, resources, and wish. There had to be political will of the country's leader, something different from the will of the Soviet Empire's rulers. It was a risky decision, and I'm still puzzled by what motivated this move. It must have been intuition, because we started filming it in 1979 under Brezhnev, then under Andropov, with his genetocracy throwing its weight around. I was invited to the screening. It was still raw material, not the final cut, but I already knew it was an epoch-making movie in the making. To Veriko's key phrase, "Does this path take me to the church?" Mzeko replies, "No." Mr. Shevardnadze suggested that she say, "No, this is Varlam way, and it doesn't lead to the church." Actually, if you ask me, it meant rocking the boat further to state that we were still living on Varlam way, and things remain the same. I believe that similar to an artist's intuition, there is a politician's intuition. He spotted chinks in the armor, and repentance may very well have been the biggest chink in the armor. He sensed that he had to break new ground. That era had to end and give way to something new. Without Mr. Shevardnadze, there would have been no repentance. It would have been an enormous loss for Abuladze, and no one knows if anyone could step in to make a similarly tremendous contribution to the history of the Soviet Union or its turning point. Who could fill in for this film and its impact? I'm aware of your attitude toward art and theater. Georgian cinema was among the top 10. Paradoxically, the small-sized cinema industry of this small country, with virtually no equipment, was among the top 10 worldwide. Celebrated directors, artists, and other creative figures visited our country. Once, I took Kozintsev to see Blue Horses on Red Grass, directed by Robert Sturua. And Kozintsev asked me, "Tell me, child, are we in the Soviet Union?" Then he saw People from Yesterday, staged by Timur. And before that, there were Robert Sturua's shows. Antigone, Mikhail Tumanishvili's masterpiece, also premiered during Shevardnadze's time.
მოსკოვში ერთ გასტროლებზე, მაშინ რუსთავის თეატრში ვარ, ჯერ კიდევ. გასტროლებია 5-6
We toured Moscow. I was still with Rustaveli Theater. We had 5-6 plays in our repertoire. A great tour, indeed, especially Sturua's performances, going off with a bang, Caucasus style, no less. At 8 to 9 in the morning, after performing People from Yesterday, the night before, someone knocked on our door. We opened it to find Mr. Akaki Bakradze. What is it? I asked. Shevardnadze just called. Why? He wants to know if the audience liked People from Yesterday. He called at 8 in the morning to find out how People from Yesterday had turned out. It didn't happen out of the blue. It was an ingrained impulse, natural drive, underpinning his attitude toward spirituality. Had it not been for Mr. Shevardnadze, Otar Iosiliani would have never moved to Paris, where he shot several brilliant movies.
The
hardest part lay in the diplomacy of relations with the Kremlin. It wasn't hard for those with ordinary goals, but if your goal was even slightly out of the ordinary, if you wanted to be ready for something new, such as at least partially ushering in the principle of personal freedom and so on, then you had to make full use of your gray matter and figure out how to disguise your true intentions aimed at longer-term prospects, and disguise them in a way that eventually proved helpful, not obstructive. I remember how he called me in one day, totally unexpectedly, at 9 in the morning, and tasked me with fostering the development of ballet. You are too old to dance, and so am I. But let's at least make sure others can dance. Theater is more or less on its feet. Cinema and painting are all set, but ballet is going through a sticky patch. Some may remember that there was a ballet school founded by and named after Chabukiani on Plekhanov Avenue, and it had just one dance studio. The building itself was narrow and outdated. With Shevardnadze's support, the school relocated into a new facility. He was very happy about the state paying due attention to this sphere as well. Encapsulating what had been accumulated in Georgia's spirituality and culture over these decades, it comes across as a modern Georgian Renaissance. I think he did a good job developing the spirit of that generation, because it's one thing to express it in poetry or song, but it's a whole new ballgame when you're actually implementing it in a political setting by navigating the complex Soviet system, pave the way for and to save your country, its culture and language.
საქართველოში მე მგონი კაცი აღარ დადის, ვინც არ გაუგონია თუ როგორ შეძლო მან თავის დროზე.
Everyone in Georgia knows how he, back in his day, managed to pacify an agitated stadium crowd. This agitation may have resulted in casualties. It was back in Soviet Georgia, when Russian and Georgian soccer clubs maintained a traditional rivalry on the pitch. Just a few seconds before the end of the game, The referee awarded an unfair penalty kick to our opponents. Of course, they scored. A multitude, especially young people, flooded the pitch and ran after the referee. We whisked him away through the players' gate, down into the basement where the crowd couldn't get him, and locked the door. Police forces were standing guard, and shooting seemed imminent. With the referee now out of reach, the crowd started hurling sticks and stones toward the skybox. I wasn't scared. I asked for a chair because it would be impossible to jump out of the box without it. I stood on a chair, stepped outside the box, and into the crowd. He managed to speak with them, to convince them in a totally extraordinary situation. Then he took charge and led them into the street, through the arched gate. The volatile situation was diffused. That's the way to do it. You put yourself on the line. Doing that makes someone capable of dealing with crowds. Naturally, you take a liking to someone like this. We were happy to see a person emerge who, besides being very principled, was committed to doing the right thing. We were captivated by his methods of combating every vice.
Რაღაცა ისეთი მეთოდებით ცდილობდა აი ბრძოლას ყველაფერ მანკიერთან რაც რა ვიცი ჩვენს აღტაცებას ეწევით.
I served as an interior minister for almost 7 years. This enabled me to see the system from a different angle, to discern things hidden from the secretary of a regional committee, for example, or for a scholar and others. I discovered many things strikingly unacceptable to me. Strikingly. And I realized that it was a system living on borrowed time. Wherever Mr. Shevardnadze worked, he was always for the Georgian people, for their prosperity, and he knew that restricting a person's liberties was devastating and equivalent to trampling a person down. If he were a careerist person, he would have never married Nanuli, the daughter of a repressed person. And that says a lot, you know. You cannot love your country so much and work so hard for its benefit just to move up the career ladder. Impossible. Making a career was never an end in itself for Shevardnadze. He could have easily given it up, which he actually did more than once. He invested his heart and soul in pushing the country forward, in implementing reforms designed to promote arts, culture, language. No one forced him to do what he did to protect the Georgian language's official status, right? But we could have lost our native language forever. He did kill himself protecting it, did he not? For me, 1978 was a special year, not only in my personal life, but also in the history of Georgia. It marked an event when people, notably youth, proved to authorities that they were capable of defending their language and homeland. I was convinced that the Georgian people would not compromise. I couldn't compromise either, so I prepared myself because I could clearly picture possible repercussions. The whole university, the major driving force at that time, and its students rose up in protest. And what does Eduard Shevardnadze do? He summons Nodar Dumbadze and Jansu Chakviani, his lifelong friends, and sends a message through them for the faculty to take charge. Do not leave the children high and dry. Nodar was at the university. Edward called and asked him to join the protesters. I need your help, he said. My husband told me, and not many people know about it, He said, Lali, I was there in the office. And Suslov, this reactionary Russian chauvinist, hardcore partisan carrying authority across the Soviet Union, calls Shevardnadze and says in a frenzy of rage, "What's going on there? What's with that three-ring circus you're having down there? What are these students doing? How dare they? What do you mean they're taking to the streets?" Eduard replies, "It's not just students. Professors are with them too." A session is scheduled for the morning of April 14th. The text of my report is ready, and I intentionally move it, the section, on the status of the Georgian language, to the end of the document. Of course, its wording was dictated by the Politburo. So there I am reporting on the national economy, Georgia's prosperity. Nobody's listening, of course. Nobody utters a sound either. Their eyes, however, tell me that they are somewhere else, not in the hall. Those sitting behind me send me messages. What's going on outside? Next, I receive the first note. Students have gathered. The Presidium's members, including the head of the KGB, keep going in and out. The audience is in shock, overwhelmed by a sense of impending doom. There must have been 20 to 30,000 people, not just youth, but also members of the intelligentsia. And I said, after giving much thought to this provision, we have decided to keep the wording that declares Georgian an official language. No words can fully describe the excitement of the audience, including even old, hardened communists, KGB employees, and many others. And it wasn't just about language anymore. Casualties were averted, people were saved, and no blood was shed. After a round of applause and ovations, I announced, "Now let's go down to your children." As usual, the meeting session was held in the government palace. So I went down to the courtyard, only to find it packed with tanks. They were expecting me to announce the wording dictated by the Politburo, which could have triggered something similar to the events of 1956. I believe that it was a victory, a real victory. One of the Politburo members, Kirilenko, if I'm not mistaken, told me, "It's all on your party committees?" Your party committees? What party committees? Whom do we have on the university party committee? What did he mean? Must have been a party committee secretary, like Rismag Gordeziani of the State University. True, Rismag and the university's rector worked hard to launch a movement to protect the Georgian language. I needed it. It was necessary. Ingratitude is the worst thing. You just cannot underappreciate the fact that the Dedaena, mother tongue, statue adorns Tbilisi. It was unheard of at that time. There was a critical moment in the 1970s when tensions started boiling over in Abkhazia. I remember that father was about to fly to Sukhumi. I left my room and saw him getting ready to leave in our long hallway. Standing behind him, I clearly saw him make the sign of the cross. It was the 1970s. My father was a party member, a school principal and teacher, a learned man who believed in God, though he had to hold it back. I remember him rise early in the morning to go through his students' homework, making the sign of the cross. I was puzzled because communism and the sign of the cross were like oil and water. My mother believed in God and prayed, but she was afraid to show it. We always had grand celebrations on Easter. One of our close relatives, a hardened communist, objected to it whenever he visited us. How can you keep Easter eggs in your family? Yet they were mandatory features of a festive meal. Father replied, "You know, I'm actually celebrating my daughter's birthday. I was born on Easter. In a way, I get a feeling that he embraced the Lord's faith inwardly. He regretted many things. And somehow, the story of the airplane boys comes to mind first. He knew that, at that time, he couldn't help them. But as he himself admitted, an enormous sense of regret over not having been able to do anything haunted him all his life. I have vivid memories of the time when the phone rang, and he learned of what had happened, how he and mother rushed to the airport, and in what emotional condition they were in. Let's not forget that this was outside Shevardnadze's purview. It was a Soviet Union and a case in a league of its own. The operation is led by Inauri, the highest-ranking officer, Lieutenant General. They have their own rules in the army, right? Every step is taken up with Inauri. He asks, "Do you agree?" And the reply is, "Hold on." On Shevardnadze's request, the parents were asked to persuade their children to surrender in order to avoid imminent capital punishment prescribed by the law at that time. I don't know why, but they turned down the offer. He really wanted to go aboard the plane and talk to them at a risk to his own life, as was his habit. But they wouldn't let him. There's only so much a man can do. The decision on execution by firing squad was made by Inauri, but he wasn't a judge, was he? No, he was not. Gersamia was the judge. Was Gersamia influenced? That remains a question. It really disquieted him until his very last breath. He suffered an enormous trauma, a devastating blow, but in essence, it was an exemplary punishment, and it doesn't matter which KGB structure made this decision in Moscow. Let the plane take off, Russians demanded, just like they did back when that plane was shot down over Chelyabinsk. My friends and I, being young and overzealous, tried to scrutinize him. What if you resigned? Well, I would, but nothing would come out of it. They would be executed regardless, except that I would have resigned. And it would have been a slightly populist move on my part. Suddenly, he looked at me and said, "I don't know. It might have been better for my family." Life is a most complex and challenging phenomenon, and let no one boast of being the perfect judge of character. You're a traitor, and you're loyal. Let life itself be the judge. He was an entirely different breed, and everyone sensed this, especially given the fact that a man with a smile on his face and a great sense of humor arose to replace Gromyko, Mr. No.
Are you pleased with the talk so far, sir?
Aren't you tired yet? And this very smile thawed the Cold War. He and his sense of humor set the stage for a thaw in extremely tense international affairs. Shevardnadze arrived. Foreigners were having a hard time pronouncing his name to begin with, and they needed time to get used to him. He drew a lot of attention, with everyone trying to intercept him, at least to exchange a word or two, to shake hands. I remember my first meeting with Reagan. He treated me like an enemy, literally.
მანამდე იყო ძალიან დიდი, ასე ვთქვათ, ავტორიტეტი გრომიკო, საგარეო საქმეთა მინისტრი, რომელიც დიდხანს იყო და Mr. No-ს სახელით იყო ცნობილი და მისი
Before him, there was longtime Foreign Minister Gromyko, also known as Mr. No, who never smiled. Tensions are soaring, it's a Cold War, so Americans arrive, grim-faced, with a spiteful attitude. During the first meeting, Reagan says, "We are a democracy, you are not. You can stand in front of the White House and scream, 'Down with Reagan, down with Reagan.' No questions asked. Can you do the same here?" Shevardnadze fires back, "Yes, you can. You're welcome to stand by the Kremlin and scream, 'Down with Reagan, down with Reagan,' as much as you please. No questions asked." Reagan loved to retell the story. As far as I know, he did an about-face right away.
თვითონ ყვებოდა მე ამას რეიგანი, რამდენადაც მე ვიცი, რომ იმ წუთში შეეცვალა მისი შეხედულება და დამოკიდებულება.
Foreign Minister?
No, I understand he is delivering.
Mr. Foreign Minister, can you
Did you receive a letter from the Foreign Minister? No, still waiting. Mr. Foreign Minister, can you tell us what the letter reads? If I tell you, I'll have nothing left for Mr. President.
What shall I tell the president?
These personal relations proved decisive. By the way, I visited President Reagan at least 15 times. I'll tell you after negotiations with Mr. President. Over time, I grew on him, and he came to trust me. Good news, Mr. President? Forecast is good. He took me out for lunch after every meeting, an unprecedented honor for any foreign minister. Foreign Minister Shevardnadze. He would crack tons of jokes. He probably knew more jokes than anyone else. Welcome back. We've met here before. It's our third time here. Right. This frankness, this forthrightness, especially in the initial years, propelled an exceptional relationship, shaping such an important factor in international relations as trust. The first 3 years marked a period of building trust and faith in the possibility of ending the Cold War. At the first meeting, Shevardnadze, in line with Georgian tradition, presented his counterpart, Mr. Schultz, with a dagger, a product of traditional Georgian crafts, and a weapon serving Georgians in defending their independence. The Soviet Union has already laid down its arms, and now it's your turn to take a step towards disarmament. We met again 15 to 20 days later in New York. I told him, in Helsinki, I had a feeling that we could do a lot for the benefit of our people. Let me shake your hand, he said. And shake hands we did, never betraying our principles since. We often said, I can do this, or I can't do this. I never objected to him again. I just believed and knew that he was right. What I just described was a demonstration of new thinking. At first, people were genuinely surprised and suspicious. But later on, over the next 5 to 6 days, I established contact with almost anyone who was anybody in the global arena.
Jim Baker and I first got to know President Shevardnadze when he was Foreign Minister of the Soviet Union, and we quickly learned that he was somebody whose judgment and word we could trust. He and Jim Baker, in fact, became an extraordinary diplomatic team, working successfully on issues as varied as arms control, German unification, and combating Saddam Hussein's aggression in the Persian Gulf. They became fast friends and achieved unimaginable levels of Soviet-U.S. cooperation. And together they helped, as Mikhail Gorbachev and I were able to usher in the end of the Cold War in a way few had ever dreamt possible, peacefully.
In fact, that was the beginning of a fight known as the struggle between the reformists and the conservatives in the Soviet Union. Two systems drastically differing in terms of class distinctions advanced to a brand new level, that of partnership. Then personal relationships developed, introducing our families to each other, visiting each other's homes, and becoming friends. We Georgians love this word, zmakatsi, sworn brother. What they had was something along the lines of the sworn brotherhood. Let me go back to the Malta meeting. We wanted this event to be special. We arrived aboard Maxim Gorky, another cruise ship delivered President Bush and Baker.
A guided missile cruiser.
Let me tell you about their struggles.
Well, I'll tell you how the battle actually proceeded, and how...
Assailed by stormy weather, we watched them disembark. They tried at least 10 times, but failed. Then at last, they reached our cruiser. We worked hard to make sure that this meeting was a success and ended the way it ended. It was the beginning of the end of the Cold War. We ascertained that we were not rivals. A major discovery for that time. Should I go on about what happened next?
Shall I continue? Shall I say what happened?
Let me, I remember a number of meetings with you, Eduard, where you told me on any number of occasions, we will not use force to keep the Soviet Empire together. When we first started out, I have to tell you that President Bush and I and other policymakers in the United States were very skeptical. But it was after the Wyoming ministerial, after the Malta meeting, where we concluded that we could trust what you said and what your colleagues said. There had, of course, as you recall, been an unfortunate experience here in the United States with trusting the Soviet Union in terms of Afghanistan, and we were therefore somewhat leery of being too quick to come to that conclusion. In the Vnukovo airport in Moscow, the day after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, when I flew to Moscow and we stood together, shoulder to shoulder, and condemned that invasion, and both supported an arms embargo on Iraq. Never before, of course, had the United States and the Soviet Union cooperated in any kind of a political statement or action against one of the allies of the other. But you did that. You did it against the advice of many strong Arabists in your foreign ministry. It was an extraordinarily courageous and difficult decision for you to make. As I recall it, President Gorbachev was traveling somewhere and you could not even get his approval, but you did it nevertheless because, as you told me at the time, it was the right thing to do. That was the key, I think, one of the keys, again, to a peaceful end of the Cold War.
Something amazing happened. Yesterday's enemy, the U.S. Secretary of State, lands in Moscow to disclose their plan to meet me at 2 or 3 in the morning. Whatever happened to the Gold War? Both of us, and both our states, are now fighting for justice.
From then on, throughout the period of the Gulf War, the United States and the Soviet Union, they did not see everything exactly the same way. You will remember the incident with the Iraqi ship sailing toward an Iranian port, and everybody in the United States government wanted to blow the ship up because we had put this embargo on the transport of oil from Iraq. When I went to Moscow and told Eduard that we had concluded that a land war was required, he was quite concerned. He wanted to make sure that we knew what we were doing. And he questioned us. He said, "This is the fourth biggest army in the world. Do you know what is involved in doing it?" You said, "Please give us 2 or 3 days. Let me see if we can't work this out with Baghdad." And fortunately, President Bush agreed with that. The American military did not take the ship out. And the Soviet Union and the United States worked that way throughout the period of the Gulf War. If we had not been able to give you the 2 or 3 days, I think the entire international coalition that was put together to eject Iraq from Kuwait would have dissolved at that time. That happened because of one man, and he's right up here on the stage with me.
ასე ადგილ-ადგილ ხდებოდა შევარდნაძე გაკეთებული ისე უჩუმრად ყნარად საქმეები.
Thus, we kept encountering the low-profile good deeds previously accomplished by Shevardnadze, such as the return of Jews, a far-reaching factor. Because at that time, Israel was the Soviet Union's declared enemy. But Shevardnadze effectively paved the way for reconciliation with this foe. He took apart the whole Soviet Iron Curtain principle. He took down the Berlin Wall for Germany. Shevardnadze maintained excellent relations with China, one of the most dangerous countries for the Soviet Union. Equally dangerous was Iran. Shevardnadze was the first to get through to Iran. Khomeini nicknamed him White Fox, a major compliment in politics. He realized that Shevardnadze was a political player. As for White, it's self-explanatory. Shevardnadze had his own way of doing things. He would set up necessary conditions, but blend into the woodwork just the same. He never let his guard down. Let me revisit the Malta meeting.
Well, I'll go back to Malta anyway.
After the conclusion of our talks aboard the Soviet cruiser, the guests were supposed to return to their ship. In the meantime, the weather at sea had gotten rougher. Remember?
Oh, very well.
They sailed off all right, but couldn't board. Then they returned seeking political asylum aboard our ship.
That's right. That's true. We did too.
If it was stated in Malta that we were no longer rivals, after the Wyoming talks, we shook hands, hugged, and promised each other that our two states would be partners from then on. Now that was a major victory.
Hug one another. From now on.
Previously, Jim did not always observe the equal footing principle in our relationship. But after negotiations, he took me fishing. We put on fishing boots, entered the river, and fished for 2 hours. Of course, I came away empty-handed, but Jim somehow pulled this itsy-bitsy fingerling out of a hat, as it were. He must have had it hooked in advance. Then there was the Baikal Lake meeting. We fished there, too. Seems like all we did was fishing. That's where I got back at him with a vengeance. I took him into a zone with no fish whatsoever.
And we did some fishing there too. As you see, mostly what we did was fishing.
On Lake Baikal. That's true. That's absolutely true. That's very true, but we ended up catching 2 fish finally. And when we got back to the docks for the mandatory photo opportunity, Eduard was very quick to grab the smallest one and stick the biggest one in my hand so that I could hold up the bigger fish and he had the smaller fish.
Somebody else must have caught those 2 fish.
Well, but those 2 fish were caught by someone else.
The Soviet Union was rotten to the core, indeed, and it had to change. The system had to change. A different society had to evolve, and that gave rise to Gorbachev's idea of perestroika, democratization. Unfortunately, though, he didn't have a clear idea of where exactly democratization would lead. With genuine democratization in place, Europe would be liberated, of course, and Germany would reunite, and the Soviet republics would claim independence.